Hey guys, what's going on? It's Jay, and in this video I'm going to show you how exposure works using the Sony a7 IV. Now I'm going to focus on photography first, and then we'll discuss video at the end. Now we really need to talk about exposure for a minute, so I want you to refer to this exposure triangle illustration I made, and we'll discuss this further, and then we're going to go into the lab and I'm going to show you how this works live using the Sony a7 IV that I got right here. So cameras today, pretty much all cameras, have three tools built in to help you manipulate exposure. So we have what's called aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, or ISO. So think of aperture like a lens pupil. The larger it is, the more light that can come through. The smaller it is, the less light that can come through over a period of time. Now, aperture is measured in f-stops, and the lower the f-stop number, the larger the aperture. Now, in an actual lens, this is called the aperture diaphragm. And as you can see here on my 7 Artisans 35mm f/0.95 lens, the aperture diaphragm is gigantic when it's fully open at f/0.95. But when I turn this fully manual lens aperture diaphragm, you could see how that lens pupil or aperture diaphragm is closing down. Now, if you can just humor me for a second, if you were to imagine water flowing through the hole of the aperture diaphragm, you can imagine that if it's wide open, the water is going to flow through really quickly. It'll take less time to get like X amount of water. Like if I was pouring a gallon of water through, it would go much faster if the aperture was wide open. Now, if you've stopped that aperture down, you have a tiny hole, it's going to take longer for that water to get through. And light works the same way. So you might have heard the term fast glass, and fast glass is used to describe lenses that have fast apertures or large apertures. And again, referring to the water analogy, the reason why it's called fast is because it takes less time for the light to get into the sensor. So if you're taking a photo in low light, you need a fast shutter speed to freeze the action. A large aperture lens will be easier to do that with because it, like I said, it takes less time for the light to get in. I will show you that in the lab in a second to help like put these pieces together if you're not quite visualizing it, okay? But that is the basic concept of how aperture works. So when it comes to shutter speed, how you need to think about that is time. So there's a mechanism in front of the sensor that goes up and down and basically exposes the sensor for a certain amount of time. Now, if you want a freeze action, you're going to want a really fast shutter speed so there's no motion blur. If you want motion blur, you're going to have a slower shutter speed, and that will allow movement to be captured on the sensor. Now, shutter speed is also measured in f-stops, but it's represented as like fractions if it's a really fast shutter speed, like 1/500th of a second, and then it goes all the way to like full seconds if you want slow shutter speeds, like all the way up to 30 seconds, for example. And then there's bulb mode on top of that where you can get really long exposures. All right, so the last side of the exposure triangle is ISO. Now, ISO you need to think about as the gain of the sensor or the sensor sensitivity. So if you can imagine a stereo with nothing playing and you just crank the volume up, you know that noise you hear, that like, that's like the gain. And that's kind of how a sensor works, similarly. So the higher you have the ISO, the more gain that is applied to the sensor, so you're going to get a little bit more digital noise. However, it will allow you to capture light faster, similar to how the aperture works, the larger aperture. The more sensitive sensor will just grab the light faster. It's like a sponge that like is more activated type thing. So that's how it works, but at the cost of noise. So in general, you're going to want to have the ISO as low as possible to have the cleanest images or cleanest video as possible. But like I said, depending on your shutter speed and depending on the lighting conditions in your scene, you might have to raise up the ISO. And, it's important that you know what's going on because it's all connected. So with all that being said, guys, let's get into the lab here. I'm going to set it up right behind me, and I'm going to show you how all this works live with the Sony a7 IV. But listen, these concepts apply to all cameras. So it doesn't have to be an a7 IV. You can follow along with any camera that you have as long as you have manual mode and stuff like that. You have to have aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual mode to do what I'm going to do if you want to follow along. So let's just get right into it. Hey, so one other quick mention. Below the video in the description area, I got affiliate links and I have lists of the gear that I use and stuff like that. And I also have navigation links down there if you want to skip ahead in this video. So if you guys want to check that out, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you very much. All right, so on the top of the camera, I have it set to A mode, which stands for Aperture Priority Mode. And if I change my display here by hitting the display button on the Sony camera, you can see here in this mode of display, if you cycle through, there's a bunch of different modes. But up here on the top left, you could see it says A there for aperture priority. And it's a picture of the camera in like photography mode. It's not a video camera icon. So that's how I have the camera set. I have it set to the photography mode on the A7 IV again, aperture priority. Now, notice here how it says f4. That is the aperture. So I currently have on here the Sony 35mm f1.8 lens. So I have the aperture set to f4 right now, and I have the focus set to flexible spot, and I'm using this thing to move the focus point around. I can also touch to move the focus, but I want to use this joystick here. Alright guys, so the first thing we're going to want to do is, for this demonstration, I'm going to turn the ISO off auto and put it on a fixed value. So I'm going to go to ISO, and I'm just going to put it on something like, let's put it on ISO 400 or something like that. Okay, so now we're on ISO 400, and that's where it's locked in. Now, notice how the shutter speed is at 1/20th of a second. F4 and ISO 400. This little thing here is the exposure compensation. That's why it just says 0 for now. That will change in manual mode. But regardless, watch what happens now when I open up the aperture. So it's at f4 right now. So opening it up means literally opening it up like the pupil of your eye. So right now I'm at f1.8. That is the max aperture of this 35mm f1.8 lens. And notice when I opened it up how much faster the shutter speed automatically got. You see that? So in aperture priority mode, if you have the ISO locked down to a fixed number, the shutter speed will change automatically to compensate for the amount of light that's coming in. So again, watch when I stop it down. So now I'm closing down the aperture. So I'm making the hole smaller, right? I'm closing that hole down. And watch what happens. Look how it takes longer for the light to get in. So the shutter speed is slowing down as I stop down the aperture. So all the way here, let's see, f8. You could see at f8, the shutter speed is now at 1/4 of a second. I'm actually at f9 now. It's a little bit hard to see when it's orange there. So 1/4 of a second. So that's a really slow shutter speed. So another thing that Aperture does is depth of field. Now notice when I'm at f9 here, notice how the background, there's more detail coming in to play. And if I keep going all the way to like f22, you can see the background's now pretty sharp. It like looks effectively sharp. That's called depth of field. So depth of field is the area of acceptable sharpness. So right now I am focused on the quarter and the background like looks fairly sharp. Now it's not going to be tack sharp, like I'll show you a photo of it. Actually, I'm going to set the self timer because I don't want to have camera shake. So I'm just going to set the self timer, and that's in drive mode here. If you go into the drive modes, you could set self timer. That's really helpful if you're taking a slow shutter like this, because now it's saying 1.6 seconds. So if you take the photo like that, you're not going to introduce camera shake. So I always use the self timer when I do lab testing stuff like this. But anyways, there's the depth of field. It's very large. So now watch what happens when I open up the aperture. Watch how the background gets blurry. And that's the depth of field. So now I'm focused on the quarter, and now you can see the depth of field is very narrow because even the dollar bill is slightly out of focus. It's pretty incredible how narrow a depth of field you can get with a full frame camera with a fast aperture lens. So that's the basic concept of aperture. You can control, like again, the size of the aperture diaphragm, and it also controls depth of field. Now, if you have the ISO set to auto, it'll pretty much just keep the shutter speed at like a reasonable speed for most people hand holding, as you can see here. So now notice the ISO is set to auto, but if I press the shutter speed, it'll tell you the value, and it says it's 160. And notice how it's keeping the shutter speed at 1/40th of a second. So if I stop down now to like whatever, f5, see how the shutter speed stayed at 1/40th of a second? That's what auto ISO is doing for you. It's keeping the shutter speed at a constant, but notice how the ISO is now at 1250 is what the ISO is at now. So that's pretty much how that works. All right, so let's talk about shutter speed quickly now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn this camera a little bit so we can see. It's just a little fan. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch the camera on the top to shutter priority mode, and then I'm going to change the ISO to a fixed value again. Let me go back to 400. Seems like a pretty good number. And that's where we are. So now we have the camera locked at ISO 400, f 1.8 and 1/400th of a second. And you can see there's a bunch of stuff flashing. And that's basically telling us that it's underexposed. And now you can see the aperture is flashing again. And there we go. So that's a proper exposure right there when everything stops flashing. Right about there, pretty much. So that's what we're looking at for a proper exposure at ISO 400. Now, what I want to show you is how shutter speed affects time. So at 1/30th of a second, watch what happens when I take this photo. Let me scroll over here and focus on the fan. All right, so watch this. Let me actually turn the self timer off. All right, so let me spin this guy. And now look at the motion blur capture. Do you see how the fan is looking all blurry and stuff? That's motion blur, and that's because the shutter speed was at 1/30th of a second, allowing enough time for that fan to rotate a couple of times while the shutter was open. So now let's raise that shutter speed up to something faster. Like let's go to 1/400th of a second, but we're going to have to change the ISO here to something higher. So I'm just going to put it on auto to let the camera do the work for me. But I wanted to show you how when you have the ISO fixed, you will have to, raise it and lower it. So right now we're looking at ISO 3200 to get 1/400th of a second shutter speed. So let me spin this again. Take a shot. If we hit the playback menu, you see how the fan is frozen now? So I just froze the action, and that's pretty much how it works. So if you want to freeze an athlete running, a dog running, whatever the case may be, those lower shutter speeds will give you that silky water, streaky taillights, things like that. And that's how you would do it. You just slow down the shutter speed. So now let's switch the camera into manual mode, and I'll show you how this all pretty much works, because it all kind of works together. All right, so now we're in manual mode. Now the ISO is set to auto, so I'm going to take that off auto, and I'm going to put it on 100. Actually, let me put it on 400 because it's kind of dark in here. All right, 400. So that's what the exposure looks like at these current settings. And if you notice, the shutter speed is still at 1/400th of a second. So when you're in manual mode, usually on most cameras, there's multiple dials. So the dial on the front right now is controlling the aperture. As you can see right here, it's turning orange. The dial on the back is controlling shutter speed. And ISO, I don't have programmed to anything, so I have to hit this button here to change ISO. But I can put it on this wheel, but I didn't want to customize the camera for this tutorial yet. I just wanted to show you how it works at pretty much default. So anyways, we are underexposed. So now when we're in manual mode, notice here how the exposure comp switched, and now it's a metering mode. So it's telling us we're -2 underexposed, but we're actually more than that because it's blinking. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to either raise the ISO up, or we could open up the aperture to let more light in. So let's do that. Let's go to f1.8, and there we go. So we just let in a bunch more light, but we're still underexposed by 0.7. So we need to slow down the shutter just a little bit. Whoops, got to use this dial. So if we slow the shutter down, there we go. So now we're at 0. So that's a proper exposure. So 1/100th of a second, f1.8, ISO 400. So let's say we want a slow shutter. So we want a slow shutter. Now we're looking at a way overexposed image. So I have a 1/20th of a second shutter, which will give us nice blurry water, for example. So if you wanted like a cool blurry water shot, you might set the camera at 1/20th of a second. But as you can see, it's overexposed now. So how would we lower the exposure? We have two tools to lower the exposure. We could stop the aperture down, right? That will lower the exposure, as you can see here. Now we're at 0. So f4, let me put it back to f1.8, or we can change the ISO. So let's go in here and put it at ISO 100, for example, like so. And now we have a proper exposure. So we could change it either way, aperture or ISO, to maintain that 120 shutter speed. And now let's say we want a larger depth of field. Remember, like let's say we want more detail in the background. So we're going to have to stop down the lens. So let me stop it down. You can see the background. It's not only getting darker, but it's also revealing more detail. So let's put it at like f9. And now what we're going to have to do is either raise the ISO or lower the shutter speed more. So I want to keep the ISO at 100. So let's play with the shutter speed here and see how slow we can get it to get a proper exposure right there. All right, so we're looking at 1 full second. So in this dark scene at f9, ISO 100, we're going to need a 1 full second exposure. So obviously nothing can be moving in the scene if you want to do that. And if you want to do that, I would also recommend setting the self-timer to like 2 seconds in the drive mode area, which by default is this side of the control wheel if you push it. So now I have the self-timer set, and now I can touch the camera and then let go so there's no camera shake, and it'll take that 1 second exposure. And there you have it. So that's how you would get a large depth of field with low ISO. But again, there can't be anything moving in the scene or it's going to be blurry. And same thing with the camera. The camera cannot move, so you have to have it on a tripod like I do. I would recommend self-timer as well. So let's say we want to freeze action again, right? Let's raise up that shutter speed to, let's say we don't have to freeze like a sports athlete, but we do want a very sharp shot. We're using a telephoto lens or something and we're hand holding. So we'll put it at 1/200th of a second. Now, as you can see, the scene is really underexposed. So we're going to need to raise the ISO way up or open up the aperture or a combination of both. So the lens that I'm pretending that I'm using is the 70-200 f4. So I'm just going to open up the aperture to f4, pretend like I'm using that lens, right? And now what we're going to need to do is raise the ISO. You could see it's way underexposed still. So let's go to ISO, and then we can just raise that up. And we can just get it to where we think it looks good. Unfortunately, we can't see the exposure meter while we're adjusting it, but I'm thinking it's going to be somewhere around 3200 or so. All right, there we go, 3200. Now you can see the meter as at a 0 exposure. And that's pretty much how that works. Now, there's one other thing that cameras have, and on the Sony cameras, if you want to get into it, it's called bulb mode. So what you need to do is you need to change the shutter speed. You got to keep going all the way past 30 seconds. Watch. See that? Right here I'm at 30 seconds. If you go one more click, now you're in bulb mode. And to use bulb mode, you have to actually hold the shutter button down for however long you want. And it'll just take the exposure like that. Now, unfortunately, that means you have to actually hold your hand on the shutter. You wouldn't want to use self-timer for this mode either, by the way. So watch. If I just hold the button down, it'll expose for as long as I hold my finger on the button. And then when you let go, it'll stop. Now they make shutter release cables so you don't have to touch the camera when you do this. Or you could use the Imaging Edge app and remote control the camera so you don't have to touch the camera. And what bulb mode's great for is if you need like a 2-minute exposure or anything crazy like that. So really early sunrises and sunsets and things like that, you might want those extremely long exposures, and that's what bulb mode is for. All right, guys, so what I want to do now is I want to switch the camera into movie mode really quick and show you how it works in movie mode. Now, it's very similar, except the difference between movie and photo, though, is you really want to keep the shutter speed at a constant when recording video. When it comes to photos, that doesn't really matter, so you have to kind of think of it differently. So, for example, I'm recording in 4K 24p. So optimally, you want to double the frame rate being 24. So I have the shutter speed set to 1/50th of a second, which is as close as I can get to double the frame rate. So I don't want to change that shutter speed. So what do you do to manipulate the exposure then? You know, you're kind of limited to aperture and ISO only. That's pretty much how it works when it comes to video. So if I want to record at like f1.8 right here, I would have to lower the ISO quite a bit. So let me go down to, oh, I'm in S Cinetone. Whoops, I gotta change that. Sorry, I didn't realize it is an S Cinetone here. Let me change that off PP11. So anyways, here we are. I got S Cinetone turned off now, and we're at ISO. Let me go to ISO 100. So now we're at ISO 100. And that looks like a proper exposure. Let's say, for example, the lights were much brighter, something like this. So if I was outside, I'm kind of simulating a brighter scene because I don't have another light handy at the moment. But if the scene was really bright like this, and you wanted to use, let's say it was even this bright. So if the scene was this bright and you're outside and you need 1/50th for your shutter speed and you want to use f1.8 because you really want that depth of field, what you can do is use a tool. So they make this tool called an ND filter. And as you see here, if you turn the ND filter, it gets darker. You can see that the camera is actually auto-exposing. You're basically putting sunglasses on the lens. Now watch, if I screw this on the front of the lens, all right, so now I have a variable ND filter on there. And you can see here how I can change the exposure by turning the variable ND filter. You see that? So that's how you do it in video. You basically have to get ND filters. In my case, I like the variable ND because it's easier to use. But that's how you would manipulate. That's how you would keep the camera. If you look at the metering mode right here, that's how you would keep the aperture at f1.8, right? If you were outside in really bright conditions. Now again, I simulated that by raising up the ISO. I apologize there, but the concept is the same. So you want to maintain the shutter speed when recording video. And again, that's how you do it. You can use ISO, aperture, but shutter speed is going to be a fixed value depending on what frame rate you're using. So if you can't adjust the aperture anymore and you can't lower the ISO anymore, for example, you're at ISO 100 and it's really bright out, that's where the ND filter comes into play. All right, guys, so I really hope this video helped you out understanding, how exposure works when it comes to photos and videos using the various modes on the camera. Now, manual mode, of course, is the most powerful mode, but it's arguably also the most complicated to use. So we have the aperture mode is a little bit easier if you just want to change the aperture. Same thing with shutter speed. And, manual mode, again, is more of like a pro mode, but I highly recommend playing around with it. I would follow along with the video and try to simulate what I was doing so you can actually see for yourself when you turn the dials on your particular camera how it changes and how the exposure is affected. And that will really help just iron in your brain how all this stuff works. And again, refer to the exposure triangle illustration as well, because that'll help wrap your mind around it. If you just look at the chart and you'll be like, oh, that's right, shutter speed goes up, the ISO is going to have to go down, or vice versa, depending on how your exposure is being affected. So, all right, guys, I got to get out of here. I'm going to go to the diner with my kids and get some food. Catch up with you next time. Take care.